Hey guys, Lokai here. So, the Sonic 3K video is going to be a lot bigger than I thought it would be. It's probably going to be bigger than the CD video. Or maybe it won't, I don't know, I'd have to see the complete product. Maybe, it'll just be like a half an hour instead of 40 minutes, so. But I figured I would make a small video that's kind of a sequel of sorts to a video called My Current Stance on Sonic. Because a lot has changed with the franchise ever since Sonic Colors Ultimate and that whole debacle, and how, Sega wasn't really treating Sonic the way I felt he should be treated, especially with the movies bringing in, this newfound popularity for him. But since then, we've had tons of products, we've not just had Shadow Generations and Sonic Movie 3, but after that we had Sonic Movie 2, and we had Sonic Frontiers and Sonic Superstars, and while I haven't experienced everything, for example, I didn't actually buy Sonic Superstars, although I have played it because a friend of mine did buy it, and I played most of the adventure there, so I guess I can talk about that a little bit. But I wanted to share my stance on Sonic, and the reason I wanted to was because of a post that Sega made, which I'm going to show a picture of, where they basically made a post saying, "We're so back," and it was based on the IGN 9 out of 10 that Sonic X Shadow Generations got. And IGN is well known for not really liking Sonic that much, so getting a 9 out of 10 for anything Sonic is incredibly impressive and really shows just how quality Sonic X Shadow Generations really was, not just as a port, but also for the Shadow portion as well. And I'm not going to be going into detail on everything that's come out since then, but I will say this. I personally don't think we're quite back yet, but we're getting very close. If Sonic keeps up with the momentum he has from Shadow Generations and the Sonic movies, more particularly Shadow Generations, since that was sort of a sequel of sorts to Sonic Frontiers, it was built off of the Frontiers engine after all. It is basically Sonic Frontiers 1.5. and also Generations 2 at the same time. It's very odd, but it is built off of that foundation. And Shadow Generations was a really big step up in quality for that engine. Now granted, yes, they didn't have that big of a game to work with, so they probably had a lot of time to fix up stuff, but keep in mind, I'm hoping, at the very least, that all of the improvements that Shadow Generations brought to the formula remain in Sonic Frontiers 2. We don't know anything about Sonic Frontiers 2 yet. Heck, it probably won't even be called Sonic Frontiers 2. It's probably just going to be called something else. But there definitely is going to be another open zone style game. And just from the stuff we see in Shadow Generations, the improved level design, the improved control, Shadow Generations, in my opinion, is the best controlling boost game. And while I do have issues with some parts of it, I think what's really interesting here is that Shadow's boost control, compared to, say, something like the older boost games, is much more like a Sonic adventure game, kind of, sort of. You know how in the older boost games, Sonic felt more like a car. He was meant to go in one direction only. Any other direction was usually reserved for the drift. If you even had a drift. Sonic Forces. Still, Sonic generally controlled more like a car. He was pretty stiff. He couldn't really go in circles at all. And you were mostly kind of boxed in. Generations did open up the 3D platforming quite a bit, but you were still mostly going on forward pathways. It's just that those pathways were filled with a lot more 3D platforming, which was still really good. They were built with a much more racetrack, QTE, rhythm game-like design, where they were all about quick reaction times. And while Shadow Generations does still mostly follow this, Shadow Generations, in terms of control, just his movement feels so much better. I don't know if this is the direction that Sonic Team will be headed, but I do think it is potentially what they could use to sort of not necessarily remake the adventure formula, but sort of have a hybrid of both the boost formula and the adventure formula. That's not what we have in Shadow Generations, obviously, but with the improvements to the control, if further improvements are made, if the spin dash ends up becoming more like it is in the adventure games and not as overpowered as it was in Frontiers, albeit it was overpowered in the adventure games as well, but not as much as in Frontiers because, oh my god. Like, you can literally fly halfway across the open zone with that thing if you know exactly where to put it, just where to pull it off. But I do think it could be an interesting direction for the 3D series to go. But obviously, at this point, I don't know if they're going to go with that. If I'm being honest here, a part of me wants them to do that, but I also know that they probably just kind of want to stick with what they're doing with Shadow Generations and just built upon that in terms of just a typical boost game. But it would be very interesting if they took Shadow Generations' control, put more of an emphasis on movement options, like, say, the spin dash in Sonic Adventure, but still kept the boost and the boost speed at that. Imagine using the spin dash to launch yourself and then air boosting the rest of the way. Wouldn't that be a really, really cool idea? I think that'd be great, especially for an open zone Sonic game because, well, I mean, it's an open zone Sonic game. One of the fun parts about an open world game is traveling the open world, and one of the fun parts about, say, Sonic in Sonic Frontiers, or really any of the open worldish kind of fan games, is just running around fields as Sonic and just tearing through terrain, albeit sometimes with stuff that's unintentional, like, say, rail launching. But still, like, that stuff is fun. It's a bit broken in Frontiers, mostly because the spin dash is overpowered, and rail launching was definitely not supposed to be in the game, but regardless, it is fun to launch yourself and travel at high speeds and skip stuff as Sonic. It's really, really fun. And I want them to do kind of more stuff like that. Obviously, you can still keep some of the QTE-like reaction-based design in some, in some form, but I'd like it if they tone it down for future games and focus more on what the adventure games did, or even what the classic Sonic series did, and sort of come up with a hybrid of, like, what adventure was, what the boost games did, while also, like, improving upon both at the same time. Which I know is very ambitious. It's probably not even something they're going to fully do for the next game, so I'm not going to expect that they do that, because I know, it's Sonic Team. You have to kind of set your expectations of, into what's reasonable. They are still owned by Sega, and that's something that's incredibly ambitious. I do think Sonic Team has the talent to pull it off, especially now. But whether Sega will give them the time to remains a mystery, so it's just an idea I had. I'd like to see it, and hopefully maybe Frontiers will steer it in that direction. But even if we just get a traditional boost open zone Sonic game, honestly, if Shadow Generations is anything to go by, I think we're in for a treat, because, like, in Shadow Generations, I'm not going to talk about it for a while, but Shadow Generations really was just a massive step up in almost every regard. Like, the level design was so much better. It honestly, in some ways, is as good as in the original Sonic Generations, which I already felt had some of the best 3D Sonic stage design. And Shadow Generations, for the first time since OG Generations, has levels that match the quality of stuff like Seaside Hill or Sky Sanctuary in Generations. Levels like Sunset Heights and Kingdom Valley and Chaos Island Act 1, and it's like, wow. There are some things I do think they should remove, though. For one thing, there are some little control hiccups I feel like they could do without. Like, for example, the really weird jump turning with the double jump. This was a thing in Frontiers, and it doesn't happen in any of the boost games. It doesn't even happen in Forces, which is why it's so weird that it happens in Frontiers and Shadow. But in Frontiers, you had this weird thing where if you were using the double jump and you were turning, Sonic had to do a full 360 turn with the double jump, and it's there for Shadow, and I wish they would just remove that. I just think it's bad. It just doesn't feel right. You know, no other Sonic game has this, so I don't understand why Frontiers had it, and it makes even less sense that Shadow Generations has it with all of the improvements they did make with that game. I do think Shadow is a little too slow, just a little bit. He's still fast, but I do feel like, especially in the open zone, because they slowed him down for the open zone compared to the levels. In the open zone in particular, I think he's just a little bit too slow. Even in the stages, I would like to see if they could increase the boost speed just a tad. Just a little bit. Not too much. It doesn't have to be as fast as Unleashed, although I would like it to be. It doesn't have to be because I understand Control takes precedent, and these are games made for kids. Something like Generations and Unleashed might be a little too much for some people, even though I personally love that style of play. I love the idea of Sonic in Unleashed just barreling through everything with the quick reaction time. And while I just think that Shadow could be a little bit faster, just a little faster than some of the more recent games like Forces, Frontiers, and Shadow Gens, because they are based on the same engine. They're using the same engine. They're just different physics sets. I really hope that for the future Frontiers entries, this is probably like the biggest up in the air thing. I hope they ditch the combat. I'm going to be perfectly honest here, I just don't think combat is really something we should be doing, and honestly, with the open zone area of Shadow Gens, the white space hub, there is virtually, like, no combat in that area. And in my personal opinion, it was better for it. I don't really think you need to have combat in a Sonic open world game. To me, it just kind of felt like a failed experiment, and I also think for, like, the future open zone games, the puzzles could just be platforming challenges or time attack stuff like, you know, the ring and time attack missions in Shadow Generations, you know, the ones in the white space hub. I just feel like there's stuff that was streamlined in that open zone that you could take for Frontiers 2. You don't really need combat. You don't really need the baby puzzles that Frontiers had, you know? I think that's about it, really, in terms of complaints, like, really, because, honestly, when it comes to, like, the open zone and the levels, I really can't think of too many issues. Oh, you know, there is one issue I have, and this is actually something I might make a separate video on, because I feel like it's something that does need to be discussed. I'm not one of those people that hates 2D in 3D Sonic games. I actually think that the 2D sections in most of these boost games have added to the experience, because the boost games can be very shallow. You know, they're very kind of one-track minded in the sense that it makes the gameplay a lot more QTE-like, rhythm game-like, where you have to press the button at the right time. And so having 2D sections adds to sort of this, it gives the levels a quick change of pace, and at times, like in Generations, there are times where you can just outright skip certain 2D sections with certain shortcuts. So in a way, in Generations at least, the 2D sections were actually blended into the 3D sections in some ways, to where if you go a certain pathway, you can skip a good chunk of 2D, and that's really interesting, that's really cool. So 2D, in my opinion, added to those parts of the levels. However, now that the 2D and 3D levels are separate, in my opinion, I actually think that they're unnecessary. This is a problem I've kind of had with Sonic Frontiers, and it's probably a little bit worse in Shadow Generations as well. Because in my personal opinion, the 2D sections were a nice change of pace. They were actually an addition to the levels. However, with Frontiers and Shadow Gens, they separated the 3D sections and the 2D sections, and honestly, at that point, especially if you're going to have, like, all 3D stages, is the 2D even really necessary? Like, don't get me wrong, the 2D stages in Shadow Gens are mostly fine. I do feel like they control a bit stiffer than 2D sections in, like, Generations, like OG Generations and Colors, and even in some ways Forces, in some ways. Calm down. But in my opinion, I feel like the 2D sections don't really add anything to the gameplay, and in many ways it's just more work because they have to make a completely new physics set simply for the 2D stages, and they have to have level design that complements 2D game design. Not to mention, Shadow Gens feels really, really sluggish in the 2D sections. Honestly, that's something I've had an issue with the 2D sections in Sonic Frontiers as well, where the 2D segments in the cyberspace stages were just so slow. And Shadow Generations is only slightly faster. The physics clearly were not really made. I don't know why, like the physics they chose or the engine they used, just it can't really do perfect 2D boost gameplay like, say, the old engine they had, which I believe was the Havoc physics engine. I don't know if it was, like, the only engine they used, but it was the main one for, like, that was their physics engine for, like, the gameplay for Unleashed and Generations, and then Colors used something different because it was made for the Wii. One of the things about Unleashed, Colors, and Generations, and even Forces to a lesser extent, the controls felt consistent between 2D and 3D. But in Frontiers and Shadow Gens, the 2D gameplay doesn't feel as tight. It feels stiffer, it feels slower. And Shadow feels even slower than he does in the open zone, probably because they don't want you going too fast because it's 2D and there's only so much screen real estate you have, so they have to slow him down a bit. And they do this for all of the boost games, obviously, but it didn't feel slower like it is in Shadow Generations. Like, Shadow feels more sluggish in 2D than he does in 3D, which wasn't an issue with the earlier boost games. It's probably my biggest It's probably my biggest gameplay critique is that the 2D stages, while fun because the level design is fun and the control is better than Sonic Frontiers, it's still a step down from older boost games. And it also is a step down from the 3D stages, which are infinitely more interesting. And in my opinion, I think at this point, either the 2D should be blended in with the stages again, or just get rid of it. And in my opinion, I think it's time to just get rid of it, because I don't really think it adds anything to the games anymore, It added something with, like, a Sonic Rush speed-heavy styled game, or Sonic Unleashed, or even Generations, but it doesn't really add anything anymore. And again, I don't hate the 2D stages in Shadow Generations. They're fine, they're fun, but they are a step down from even some of the 2D segments in Colors. Just leave it behind, and definitely don't do 2D in the open zone ever again, please. Don't. I mean, that should go without saying, but, like, don't do that again. Regardless, despite my complaining about, some little issues, I do think Shadow Generations is mostly fantastic. The boss fights are some of the best in the franchise. Granted, boss fights haven't really been great in Sonic, period, but Shadow Generations genuinely has really great boss fights. Like, they're actually, like, fun. All of them are mostly fun. I think that the level design is so much better. There's so much freedom. There's so many places to go. There's so many routes for speedrunning. There's so many cool tricks you can do. Kingdom Valley Act 1 in particular is my personal favorite zone in Shadow Gens, and is up there with the best levels in Generations, like Seaside Hill, Act 2, or Sky Sanctuary, both acts, where there's just so much to that stage. There's just so many things going on. There's so many pathways to take, and it's just such a fun level to play over and over and over and over again to see if you can cut down your time, or try this pathway out, or try this pathway out. And it's so good. It's such a great stage. And there are other stages like it in Shadow Gens. like Chaos Island Act 1 as well. I think that's a really good stage. Sunset Heights Act 1. That's a more boost-heavy stage. It's more straightforward, but it's still a really fun stage. Like, the level design has seen such a step up. Now, you could argue, like, oh, well, if it's only as good as the best in Generations, why does this matter? But it's like, keep in mind, we haven't had level design this good in a 3D Sonic game since OG Generations. And if they can keep up this consistency, perhaps go even better, like make stages even better than that, especially if they're original stages, like original ones with original level ideas, not just rehashes, then honestly, I'm all for it. And even the open area in Shadow Gens is an improvement from any of the open zones. And look, I like Sonic Frontiers. I don't want to, like, be down on Sonic Frontiers. Even though I don't think it's a great game, I do appreciate that it set the foundation for something that Shadow Gens would take and run with. And Shadow Generations made a ton of improvements. It really is fantastic. This is, like, the most improved Sonic game I've seen since, like, Unleash the Colors and Colors to Generations, you know what I mean? Like, they so often Sonic Team just switches up the formula with, like, every game, and a lot of the switch-ups are just either needless or make it worse, but no, for once, like, everything about Shadow Gens' changes, for the most part, are for the better. And the open zone, even though it's mostly optional, and I do think it should be the main portion of the game, so they're probably not going to do that for the next Frontiers, since the open zone is very much the gimmick with those games. Even, like, the open area, if you actually, like, go out of your way to explore it, there's so many nooks and crannies, so many little areas to go to that have secrets. There's little mini challenges and platforming sections to actually, you know, get certain collectibles. Not to mention, like, the challenges, like the little challenges you can do, like the ring challenges and the time limit challenges. Some of them can be really, really tough. Some of them can even be a little frustrating at times. There's really only one of them I particularly thought was kind of, alright, that could have been done better. But the fact that all of them actually feel like something you should do in a Sonic game, like collecting rings in a certain amount of time. Alright, that's a Sonic thing. Time attacking, speed running, that's a thing. That's a Sonic thing. You know, doing a platforming section, getting all of the collectibles while going really, really fast at a certain amount of time. Like actual Sonic challenges in the open zone. No baby puzzles where, like, oh, you have to parry, but the parry's infinite, so these challenges shouldn't be in the game. Or the jump rope challenge, where you just hover in mid-air because Sonic can do that by holding his parry. Or combat challenges, where you can't fail them. Or, like, this weird puzzle where you have to have the balls in hoops, or playing Tetris in a weird way with the Psy-loop. You know, like, none of that crap. Like, there's little ring missions, there's time attack missions. Hell, I actually think the challenge acts could actually just be integrated into the open zone. Like, instead of having, like, challenge acts in the stage themselves separated through gates, which I understand why they did. It's because it's a callback to Generations. But, like, take that and just put them in the open zone. And, you know, expand on that in and of itself. Like, stuff like that. Like, you're doing Sonic stuff in the open zone. And the open zone is so much better designed. There's so much more platforming. There's so many more areas to explore. It's weird. It's smaller and more contained, but there's just so much more to do. Like, Shadow Generations really is just a massive step up. And I can't wait to talk about it when I talk about Sonic Generations, because I am going to make a video about, obviously, when I get to it in the retrospective, I'll get to talk about Sonic Generations, and I'll make a Shadow Generations video as well. But I can't wait to talk about those two games whenever I get to them, because I'm going to be replaying these games, both of them. I mean, I'm obviously going to be replaying Sonic Generations, because it's my favorite Sonic game. But Shadow Generations, while I do have some issues with it, it is definitely in like my top 5, top 10 Sonic games somewhere, because it just really is such an improvement over Sonic Frontiers, while also just being a great game in its own right. And it's not even just the gameplay either, the storytelling is better. I know some people have issues with Ian Flynn, especially with his constant need to throw in references, and I do think he does need to tone that down. But with Shadow Generations, I felt like they kind of had him bit on a leash. Most of the references were stuff that was actually important to Shadow's lore and story. The only time I felt like the story got a little reference-heavy was when Sonic was fighting Shadow in that one cutscene, which was a reference to his boss fight in OG Gens. That was a little like, alright, calm it down a bit, Ian. I know some people have issues with him, and I definitely have issues with some of his choices, and I'm not the hugest fan of how he characterizes Amy in the most recent games, though a part of me thinks that's actually more of a Sega problem, and not so much an Ian Flynn problem. But I do think that his writing has definitely made these games so much better in terms of story. Like, say what you want to about Sonic Frontiers, but I do think that it does redeem the characterization of most of these characters. Sonic feels more like Sonic than he ever has since, like, Sonic and the Black Knight. Tails feels like Tails again. And they even actually, like, reference the fact that his characterization has kind of gone down the shitter. It's a little melodramatic, you know, them calling back to forces and saying, "Oh, Sonic, I'm a burden to you." It's a little overdone, but it's still nice that they did something with that. You got some great new characters like Sage. Eggman is... Well, I mean, Eggman's always been great, so, there's not really much they need to change for him. And Knuckles. Knuckles has probably seen the biggest glow-up. Thanks to the second movie, I'm guessing they really started to reel in on Knuckles' backstory more and how it affects him. One of my biggest issues, and I'm going to talk about it when I talk about Sonic Adventure, with Knuckles as a character was, I never liked how when Knuckles saw his backstory, he just barely reacts in Sonic Adventure. And I don't know if it's because Sonic Adventure's story was rushed, which, spoiler warning, it was, or if it's just because they just didn't feel like, showing that. But, like, Knuckles is effectively seeing, like, the first question Knuckles asks in his story is, why am I here? Why was I given this task to guard this emerald for so long? Why was I given this duty by my ancestors? Why am I the last of my kind? What happened? What led to this point to where I am now? He gets those answers, and then by the end of it, he just kind of forgets about it and doesn't really call back to it much. And, I always thought that was so disappointing, because it's like, this is why you are the way you are. This is essentially your origin. You asked these questions. Why was I given this purpose? Now you understand the gravity of this purpose and how important it is, and the sins of the Echidna's past. And, you finally have these answers, and he just doesn't really react. And I understand Sonic Adventure's story was rushed, it wasn't really as well thought out as it could have been. But, they never do anything with it in future games, and that always bugged me. But in Sonic Frontiers, you could argue it's heavy-handed if you want to, although I personally don't think so. I like that Knuckles in the games now is actually reacting to it. When the Coco actually, when they die from reliving the battle that they fought against the End, Knuckles actually is reminded of, everything that happened with his tribe and how he's the last of his kind and how lonely he is. Sure, he has Sonic and Tails and Amy, but they're not always around. Knuckles is very much a loner, and he doesn't really want to be a loner. Yeah, he understands how important it is to guard the Master Emerald, but it doesn't change the fact that his life is, it's kind of sad. And he's actually reflecting on it now. And Shadow. For Shadow and Shadow Generations, I love how Ian Flynn and Sega since apparently it's not just Flynn writing, it's also, like, Sega of Japan is also kind of, like, they're kind of coordinating, which I think is really good, by the way. I think it's good because it seems, Ian does have some writing quirks I don't like, so it's nice that Sega keeps him in check, but Ian also keeps Sega in check. They work together. They benefit each other when writing these stories. And with Shadow in particular, finally, for the first time since, Sonic 06, Shadow feels like Shadow again. And I love how they didn't just ignore the events of Shadow the Hedgehog. It would have been so easy to just say that game didn't happen. But no, Shadow truly did put the past behind him in Shadow the Hedgehog. But he still thinks about Maria. And every time he does, he's just like, no, push it down. I don't want to think about that. It's too painful. And with Maria being in Shadow Generations, with them meeting up physically for the first time, it not only is great for Maria, because she gets to see a very different Shadow who's lived through all of what happened in Shadow the Hedgehog and SA2, and knows what will become of them. But it's also great for Shadow because now he's forced to kind of realize, I can't just stop thinking about Maria. Maria was special to me, Maria was important to me, but even though she's gone, I can still hold on to her memory. Shutting her down and shutting her out of his mind is really unhealthy, and by the end of it, he does probably accept the fact that Maria and Gerald are gone. His life, as he knew it then, that chapter of his life is over, but he's able to cope with it in a much better way by the end of the story. They actually, and again, they didn't forget about Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow very much moved on from his past, but his past will always be there, somewhere in his mind. And instead of shutting it out, he embraces it, but also uses the experiences of what happened in Whitespace to once again move on while still remembering the past. You can't take away the past from Shadow, but Shadow can still move on in spite of everything that's happened. And that's not only just a beautiful story in general, but it's also just really great for the character. It doesn't retcon him back to Sonic Adventure 2 and retcon Shadow. It takes what didn't work about Shadow and makes it work, while also telling a story in and of its own, within it of itself. It's so nice that, the series has some level of continuity again. And it's nice to have, the characters act like the characters again, It's just so nice to have it. And, that's something I just really appreciate about that. And so, honestly, while I can't really say we're quite back yet, I can say we're definitely closer than ever before to Sonic fully being back, as it were. The thing I think what needs to happen in order for me to just make a quick video saying we're so back and agreeing with Sega, there's one thing that they have to do. Sonic Frontiers 2, whatever it is, has to be great. If it is a great game, we're so back. That's it. That's all it has to do. Sonic Frontiers 2 just has to be a fantastic game. It has to knock it out of the park. It just has to be a really, really great game and a great step forward for this franchise. And if it can do that, I will gladly make a brief little video saying we are so back. And honestly, it's because of Shadow Generations and even Sonic Frontiers that I'm actually really happy with the state of the franchise right now. It's not perfect, but we're getting there. The fact that the franchise is really, taking these strides to improve, finally, it seems like they're getting it, and I'm so happy to say that. And it's not even just the games either. The Sonic movies have been great. I'm not going to talk about them too much here, but I will say this. Sonic Movie 3 is great. It's easily the best Sonic movie we've had. I will admit, the movies now that the games are kind of back to the way that they arguably should have been for the longest time, with the characters acting like the characters and the stories being more interesting, I will admit I am kind of pining for something more familiar to the games than what the movies are, because the movies do have very different characterizations. You know, movie Sonic is not game Sonic, you know? They're very different characters. But I think for the movie universe, Sonic Movie 3 is easily the best one, and I think that they utilize what the movie universe is in a great way while telling their own story. Yes, it is very much still inspired by SA2, but they also do enough to make it its own story while also tying it into the movie universe really well. Sonic Movie 3 had a lot riding on it, not just for, like, you know, just being, oh, it has to be a great movie, but it also has to, like, take one of the most loved stories of Sonic and tie it into this very different universe, and it did that job really well. Sonic Movie 3 is great. If you're a fan of the franchise, you know, you'll probably really enjoy it, even if it's not your favorite interpretation of the characters, because I won't lie, Game Sonic and Movie Sonic are very different. Hell, even Movie Knuckles is very different from Game Knuckles, but I can still enjoy it for what it's worth, and I think the fact that the movies, each one is getting more and more Sonic-y by each movie. Like, really, the only misstep was the Knuckles TV show, but, you know, like, each movie gets better and more Sonic-y each time, and it seems like they get it. And honestly, I'm also just happy the movies exist, because if it weren't for these movies, Sonic Frontiers wouldn't have had the extra time it needed. Sonic wouldn't be where he is without the movies. And heck, there are some ideas that the movies have done that I do genuinely think could translate to the games in some way, like, say, the Boost Aura. It's very, you know, electrify-y. It looks like the Chaos abilities and the bioelectricity that Sonic and Shadow have when they're running. That kind of stuff, you know, that was brought into the games, and I think that's really cool. Obviously, I want the games to remain the games. I don't want them to be like the movie universe, but taking stuff from the movies and putting it in the games, I think, is not entirely a bad idea. And I'm also just looking forward to whatever comes next, because each movie gets better with each entry. Really, the only misstep, again, was a crappy TV show, but even they could improve that with future releases, so the movies honestly are doing great. So honestly, with the movies and the 3D games, I think all of that is in a better place than it's ever been. Obviously, things could change. Sonic's, you know, been very inconsistent throughout ever. Like, ever. This isn't even a matter of, like, since his jump to 3D. Like, even the classic era has a lot of stinkers, you know? It has a lot of bad spin-off games. Sonic's been very inconsistent in terms of quality. He's always been. He's always been pumped out, so it's never quite going to be perfect. But I do think that with the improvements made to the games and the improvements made to the movies, Sonic's in a very good place right now. I'm happy with where he is, and I'm so happy to say that because you remember my stance on Sonic video. I was really pessimistic and cynical, especially after Sonic Colors Ultimate, and before that we had Sonic Forces, you know? And you know, even in terms of ports, Sonic Colors Ultimate, bastardization of a great Sonic game. I don't care what people say, Sonic Colors is awesome, but Sonic Colors Ultimate was just a huge disservice to that game. Sonic Generations' port is absolutely fine in Sonic X Shadow Generations. It's basically exactly like the original, and honestly, that alone makes it the best remaster. Now yes, they could have done more with it. There are some disappointing things that I wish they did a little bit differently. Yeah, not every edition they did do is really a home run. I don't really care so much for the Chow collecting. I mean, I did it, but it's a very nothing edition. The Drop Dash is whatever. I don't really think it works super well. But it's not like a hindrance. It's just like a minor thing where it could have been done better, but it's not a hindrance to the gameplay. Sonic Generations, however, is mostly just the same. Oh, and there's also the rewrite, which I got opinions on. I'm not the hugest fan of the rewrite either. If I'm being honest here, I have a lot of issues, and I'll probably talk about it in my Generations video. But even then, Sonic Generations' story was never really the part you wanted to experience about Generations. Generations is often critiqued as having no story, because it doesn't. So them butchering what was already a pretty shit story, while it is a complaint, and it's a valid one, and I do understand the critiques, and trust me, I have them as well, it's not that big of a deal because I usually skip the cutscenes anyway. The gameplay, however, in terms of gameplay, Sonic Generations is just as great as it was 10 years ago, 10 plus years ago at this point. And now it's even better for console users, especially since, you know, I don't have a good computer, so I can't play it on PC. And I still want to. I will. One day, I will. But, like, their port jobs are better. The 3D games are better. The movies are doing really, really well. And I'm really rooting for Sonic 3 to overtake Mufasa, because fuck Disney. The only area I feel like could be improved upon next is the 2D games, because Sonic Superstars didn't do as well as Sega wanted it to. Now, to be fair, Sega probably had very wildly unrealistic expectations. I mean, they wanted to sell better than Mario Wonder, and I'm sorry, that's just that's adorable. Like, you really think you're going to beat Mario, but it's like Sonic Superstars, I think that the game is better than some people say it is. Like, Sonic Superstars got trashed by a lot of people, and I don't think it's that bad. I think Sonic Superstars is an okay game. I think the levels are really fun. The level design is really fun. I like that you can have, like, you have access to a player switch. Like, you can actually swap characters. You have a character swap just for, like, the main game. Usually with Classic Sonic, you have to play each game with that character, and each of them, like, if you want to play as Sonic and Tails, you're stuck with Sonic and Tails for the entire game. If you want to play as Knuckles, you have to play as Knuckles the entire game. You can't just swap characters, and this one you can, and while, you know, but they still have, like, some of the character-specific routes, because they have character-specific stages which take advantage of their particular abilities. So they by no means have forgotten the fact that, you know, Knuckles' playthrough is just so different. I think Sonic Superstars is honestly not that bad. Now, to be fair, I haven't played Trip's story, and I hear Trip's story is garbage, and Sonic Superstars definitely could have turned out better, but I think Sonic Superstars overall is decent, and I'll talk about it in the retrospective. Who knows, maybe when I play the full entire game, maybe I'll think differently, but for now, I honestly don't think Superstars is that bad. However, I do think it is a massive step down from Mania, and considering how Sonic Mania was such a huge success, and how the Mania team went on to work on Penny's Big Breakaway, which I hear is a really great game. I hear it's a really great platformer. It looks really, really fun, and I want to play it at some point. But it didn't sell very well. And it actually led to Evening Star, which I believe is what the team is called. That's Christian Whitehead's team. Unfortunately, because Penny's Big Breakaway didn't sell very well, it caused a layoff of some of the team, and they just haven't really been doing very well. So I think, even though obviously they don't have to do this because, you know, I'm not in charge of the company, I'm just some schmuck on YupTub, but I think it would be in Christian Whitehead's team's best interest, as well as Sega's best interest, to maybe work out a deal and make a successor, a real successor to Sonic Mania. Like what Superstars probably should have been. I don't even necessarily care if it's a pixel art game or if it's 2.5D. I don't really care about that, to be honest. I just want a game that has the same level of level design quality and game feel that Mania did. Because while Mania is not my favorite Sonic game, and I do think it is just a, you know, it is, even though it's probably tied for 3 and Knuckles as my favorite 2D Sonic game. Spoilers for the retrospective. I do think it has a few issues it could iron out. And I'd love to see that, because I think with the team having completely original stages and just being able to do whatever they want to with it, they could make something truly spectacular. And I think, you know, I don't even necessarily care if they use, like, classic Sonic. They could use modern Sonic and make, like, a sequel to the advanced games if they want to. You know how the advanced games were, you know, 2D classic Sonic, but with the 3D character designs. I don't really care. Whatever they do, I just want a successor to Sonic Mania that has that same level of quality in terms of level design and just in terms of gameplay, because Mania really was a great game. And Superstars, while it's decent in its own right and does get shat on a bit too much, it's not the Mania sequel that we should have gotten. So that's really the only area I think they could really improve. But still, if Sega is willing to listen to criticism, if they're willing to put this much effort into improving Sonic with their past few games, yeah, I think the franchise is in a much better place. I think we're not quite back yet, but we could be if this momentum keeps up. I think we're very close. So I am genuinely hopeful for the future of this franchise. So yeah, I didn't expect this video would be 50 minutes, or at least the recording of it is 50 minutes. I think I have a problem when it comes to talking about Sonic. But anyway, I'm going to get back to finishing the Sonic retrospective along with, you know, editing this and making this little random ramble. I am Lokai, signing out, and I'll see you back, whenever.